If you're an NHL team in need of a center at this year's deadline, well, first, I just feel bad for you. But second, we do have, I think, one pretty good option out there in Nazem Kadri of the Calgary Flames. And with Kadri starting to gain more and more interest as this season goes on, let's talk about his trade stock, how good of a player he still is at age 35, and who I ultimately think could be the best fits for him in the end. Make sure you guys watch till the end as we go through all of the Kadri trade fits, and hit that subscribe button if you're new for more hockey content just like this, especially on the trade side as we lead up to the deadline next spring. But let's talk about the player here and what value he could command on the market, because Nazem Kadri is a very unique and very entertaining player. Even though he's 35 years old, he still feels like he's near the prime of his career. But in terms of players that I love watching, especially on Calgary, Kadri is at the top. He is just such an electrifying player because he is always in the fight. He is always looking to make something happen, and for the last couple of years, he's been very successful at doing that with Calgary. He had a career year in Colorado, getting 87 points in 71 games. After signing with Calgary was a bit of a disappointment afterwards, only getting 56 points in 82 games the year after that, but these last couple of seasons he's gotten back to form with 75 points in 2024 and 67 points and 35 goals last season. He got off to a pretty cold start in his first few games, but is starting to wrap it up now, getting 7 points and 2 goals through his first 10 games and beating up on the Rangers in a pretty major win for the Flames. But in terms of the energy, the goal scoring, and still how good he is at his age, I think he is just the ideal middle six center for your Stanley Cup winning team. Maybe more of a third line C, but if he's more at the 2024 level of production, then I think second line center is absolutely worthy, and he's been a solid first line center for the Flames for a while now. Nothing extraordinary by any means, but he's certainly led Calgary in so many key categories and has been one of their best scorers consistently year after year, which, especially for this Flames team, has kind of been a bit of an issue. Yet it seems like for Kadri, no matter the struggles around the team, he's still able to produce. You also have to consider, too, that especially after his Leafs days, he's been very consistent in the playoffs. Back in 2020, getting 18 points in 15 games with the Avs, and then in the Stanley Cup winning year, getting 7 goals and 15 points through 16 games. He's somebody that I think is just a pretty underrated playoff performer when he actually is playing, when he's not making those stupid mistakes. I think Kadri has really learned from those mistakes in Toronto and has become a much better player for it, and hopefully that'll be able to translate for a team looking for some juice up the middle in the playoffs. The big thing that holds back the value, though, when it comes to Kadri is the contract. This is something that I think will be a major point of contention for teams looking to go after him because he is by no means a rental. Now, I think at Kadri's rate, $7 million is perfectly fair, but the term is a bit of a worry. With him being 35 years old and only being on year 4 of 7 of his contract, you're going to have to deal with that term inherently, and he's not just going to be somebody you can risk by getting a trade deadline acquisition, ship him off in the summer. It'll be a lot harder than that. But for teams looking to acquire a second line center this year and for the next couple of seasons, I think Kadri makes a ton of sense, and that kind of changes the outlook of which teams will actually be going after him. Now, it would have been a lot harder for Calgary to move Kadri if this was a year ago, but as Elliotte Friedman says, one thing about Nazem Kadri is that his contract switched this year from a full no move to a partial 13-team no trade. So if he had the full no move and the term, I think it would have been a lot harder for that deal to happen. Now, at least it's a bit easier with Kadri having less of a say. So that gets us into the main point of the video. Which teams do I think make the most sense for Kadri, not just in terms of the team fit and the schemes, but also to be able to take on that contract, their willingness to take on that contract, and what things could look like. But let's start out with the 7 teams that I think make the most sense for Kadri right now, starting with the team that I think makes the least sense out of the 7, going from 7 to number 1, and that is the Columbus Blue Jackets. A team that I think could make a move for a center, but it kind of just depends on how they view that team going forward. In the end, I do think Kadri is much more likely to be moved around trade deadline time, and Columbus is going to be a fascinating one here because it all hinges on how Charlie Coyle is able to perform, because I think he's been fine up to this point, but I think that's about the most you could really hope for in Coyle's case. The big thing is how Fantilli performs as well, because he's somebody that has kind of been up and down. He's had some good moments here and there, some good stretches, but solidifying himself as a second line center, it's just kind of been a work in progress there. If the Blue Jackets are in a playoff position or they're kind of outside of it and they really want to make a major move, going after a player like Kadri would certainly do that, and I think probably be more effective than the Charlie Coyle move ends up being. A lot of this hinges on how patient, though, Columbus ends up being, because they're a team that has made some more win-now type of moves recently. I mean, the Charlie Coyle deal is a great example of that, trying to solidify themselves up the middle, and especially defensively. Kadri is somebody that can help that too, and I think for the Blue Jackets, it all depends on how much they really need to make the playoffs this year, because I think they're a team that's starting to get a bit antsy. The big thing that helps is that Columbus has the second most cap space in the league with $14 million right now, so they could pretty easily just bring on Kadri and not have to sacrifice too much else on the roster, but they also could just have Kadri in the second line spot, have Fantilli in the third line spot, and then have a Charlie Coyle type presence as your fourth line center, which would be incredible center depth there. If that's what they really wanted to go for, I think they could easily do that and would have one of the clearest routes to do that in the league. Plus, they have a pretty good pool of solid center prospects that I'm sure Calgary would be interested in, so I think in terms of the trade fit and what the Flames might want to go after, I think for the Flames, Columbus makes a lot of sense. On to my sixth trade fit for Nazem Kadri. This is where I have the Detroit Red Wings, and they're another team that I think could be pretty interesting going after a center at this year's deadline, because it really all hinges on one player, whether they decide to pivot and try to go for a more established player, and that is Marco Kasper. Because so far, through 9 games, Kasper only has 1 goal for 1 point, and I still think he's looked okay, just not getting the greatest luck in the world. But at the same time, for that second line center spot, especially for a team like Detroit that's in a competitive Atlantic division, they might look at that, especially if he continues to struggle in the point department, and maybe look at a second line center change. Because then you would have a really good established second line center behind Dylan Larkin, and that's one of the biggest reasons why I could see Detroit making this move, is just to get some pressure off of the captain, because he has had to carry the load so much year after year, and also to start out this season. He's done a very good job doing that, but imagine a Kadri behind him, somebody that could put up around 60 points or so behind him, and especially if they were to make the playoffs, really be able to give them another center to work off of. And honestly, I'd kind of like to see them do it. They have a really stacked prospect pool, but not everybody is going to be able to find those specific spots in the lineup in the future, and there's going to be some casualties. You might as well trade those guys while they have their value still at the highest, and I think for the Red Wings, a player like Kadri could make a massive difference. Plus, they're another team that has a lot of cap space, so they could pretty easily bring Kadri on. They have about $11 million right now, so they'd easily have enough to make that deal work. Let's move on to number 5 and the 5th best fit for Kadri in a trade, and this is where I have the Utah Mammoth, a team that I think also, kind of like Columbus, has become a bit antsy. They had the big landmark JJ Peterka deal in the offseason. It's pretty obvious they want to make more win-now deals. They want to be able to make the playoffs this year. They've done a very good job of being successful so far, but they're another team that could be in the hunt, wanting to really capture maybe a Central Division spot, and a Nazem Kadri, especially for the next couple of years, would be fascinating on this Utah team. A very similar situation, I would say, with Detroit, though, where they have a decent center need at the top end that hasn't fully been fit yet. The thing that I think is interesting is that Barry Hayton has played well. It's just I don't think the point production is ever going to be where Utah truly wants him to be as a first-line center next to Keller and next to Nick Schmaltz. Those two have been incredible, and Hayton's been solid enough. But as we've seen pretty consistently, having Cooley as that first-line center with Keller and Schmaltz hasn't exactly worked out perfectly like it should on paper. He's fit a lot better with JJ Peterka and Dylan Guenther, though, and I think that second line should not be touched. So what if you just maybe had a Barry Hayton for Nazem Kadri swap, where Kadri gets placed on that first line center role, bringing some physicality and some good goal scoring alongside the playmakers of Keller and Schmaltz? I think that line could be brilliant and would kind of give them a bit more first line production than they currently have, even if they've had some good production already. I think you could have Kadri around the 60-point range or so, while Hayton's hovering more around the 40-point range. But still, I think a Kadri could be a really good solidifying presence, and especially for the playoffs if they were to make it, such a big help for them, because a lot of that team is fairly inexperienced. On to the 4th best fit for Nazem Kadri. This is where I have the LA Kings, a team that, yes, they are in the Pacific Division, which might complicate things a bit, but I just look at what LA has done and what moves they've tried to make, and going after a 35-year-old Nazem Kadri would be completely on brand. The biggest thing that I think makes this more likely to me, though, is actually the term. I think that will be actually a good thing for the LA Kings. They'll look at that and see a pretty big bright spot because, of course, Ante Kopitar and his looming retirement. Even though I still don't think the term is ideal by any means, I think for the Kings, they see that and they're like, okay, we'll have at least a solidified top 6 center for the foreseeable future. And I think with how Quinton Byfield has played up and down, he's been still good, but it hasn't quite been perfect as a centerman so far. I think the Kings just kind of want to have that backup plan in place. Plus, having a center core this year of a Kopitar, a Kadri, a Danault, you could have Byfield potentially on the wings too again. I think it could be very interesting. Another team like Columbus, though, that hasn't had a great start to the season, so I could see maybe LA trying to leapfrog a Kadri trade, maybe making that around December or January, and really trying to solidify themselves for the playoffs, because honestly, I think they kind of need it. On to the third best fit for Nazem Kadri, and you knew we were going to talk about them. Of course, it is the Montreal Canadiens, who I think are going to be a pretty interesting bidder in the Nazem Kadri race, just because of how many holes I think it fits for them, not just now, but also long term. I think they could use another scorer in that middle six, and especially in the second line center spot, even though Oliver Caplan has been scoring okay, I think some of the details have kind of been missing so far. And I think going into the playoffs, it's not quite ideal as your second line center. Kirby Dach also, you'd hope, would be in that position, but as we've seen with the consistent injuries, I just don't think you can bet on that. So looking at that center situation and getting an immediate upgrade for an Aidan Delaney, instead of trying to hope that Kirby Dach is that guy or that Kapanen's going to be perfect long term, why not just bring in a Nazem Kadri, who can finish on so many of those dangles, so many of those high-end plays that Demidov creates, and would be able to, I think, boost up both point totals quite a bit. Plus, again, when you look at the establishment in the playoffs, when you look at the consistent goal scoring, I just think for Montreal, it checks a lot of boxes. The big thing, too, that I think it also allows Montreal to do is give more time to Michael Hage, who I think will eventually be able to overtake Nazem Kadri as that second-line center, or at least that's the hope. But I think it allows them to give Hage another season in the AHL, or maybe even two in the AHL, to really refine his game, get that confidence up, dominate the AHL, and then immediately be able to turn into a solid middle sixer for Montreal. That, to me, in terms of the timeline, fits pretty well, honestly. And especially if Montreal can get some salary retained on the Kadri deal, now we're talking. That second line center spot, though, just continues to be a problem child for this Montreal team. The hope is that they can solve that internally, and it's gone okay so far, I would say. But if they really want to make some big strides, if they really want to push into the playoffs, adding a Kadri onto that roster, man, the electricity with him and Demidov, I think it would just be so much fun. Going on to the second best fit for Nazem Kadri, we go on to the Vancouver Canucks, who, just like Montreal, are basically going to be in on every single center available, like we have seen so far. We have seen so many players and so many mediocre players being floated around. You had John Gabriel Pajot. People were talking about Pavel Zacha as this generational type of player for Vancouver. That's just not the case. But Vancouver's going to be in on basically every single center who stands on two legs. And as you can see, after trading for Lukas Reichel, they're trying to make him as a center, which, ask Chicago how that worked. I don't understand why they're doing that, but that's how desperate Vancouver is for center help. They're playing a player like Lukas Reichel, who is a lost cause at the center position as their second line center. So having a team like Vancouver with the presence of a Kadri, I would say in general, there's no NHL team that needs a Kadri more than Vancouver. Especially with how this season has gone, though, for the Canucks so far. It's kind of been a weird one, with especially some of the top-end players like Quinn Hughes not looking up to their level so far, and that's a big problem. But giving those guys a bigger weapon, giving them somebody that can finish on so many of those high-end plays, I think is a necessity. They tried to do that in Evander Kane. I don't think it's been the most successful thing in the world. But hey, I mean, a Kane, Kadri, and Besser second line, that's not bad at all, and honestly would be pretty fun. The problem for Vancouver is that they always seem to go after these win-now moves that leaves their prospect pool in pretty dire straits. So I don't know, honestly, what Vancouver would trade to Calgary for this deal. I think it would honestly command quite a bit, but I think Vancouver is in a position in their organization where they can't just lie back. They need to make a massive move here, because if they don't, I just don't think they're good enough to make the playoffs. On to the number one best fit for Nazem Kadri, though, especially if we inch towards the trade deadline. Let's go on to the Carolina Hurricanes, who I think are going to be pretty much immediately in on him as soon as the name pops up. And I think they should, honestly. I think Carolina has become my new Minnesota, where any second line center that pops up, ship him to Carolina. Make it happen. So far, I think the Logan Stankoven experiment at center has gone by okay. He's scoring okay, and the faceoffs have been okay, but he's only at 44%. Not saying that Kadri is a huge improvement or anything. He's hovering around 48% over the last 3 seasons combined, so it wouldn't be a huge thing, but I think in terms of just that definitive center, I think it makes a little bit more sense. What having Stankoven at center does, though, is allow players like Jackson Blake to play on the second line, which I think is a pretty positive development. But in terms of the Canes' center situation long-term, I think Kadri would certainly make a pretty massive difference. Just like Larkin in Detroit would immediately slot behind Aho and give him just a bona fide center to work behind and take some of that pressure off, which I think ultimately makes Aho the better player. But in terms of what the Canes need in that second line center, he has term, he has that goal scoring especially, which is always the big problem with Carolina time and and time again. And in the playoffs, Kadri has shown, especially over the last few years in Colorado, to be able to prove himself well. So I think in terms of what the Canes need, in terms of the long-term shots they want to go after, the Canes have tried to go after some big names recently. They've been successful in some, not successful in others, but also the Eastern Conference, the Western Conference split too, which makes it easier for Calgary to trade to Carolina. Everything, I think, just lines up very well here. And if I'm a betting man, if I'm going to make any predictions, I think Kadri does end up with the Canes if we do see a trade. But that's it in terms of the Nazem Kadri trade fits. Certainly will be an interesting race as we inch towards the deadline. But a big thank you to the channel members here. Their names will be all up here on the screen. If you want to become a channel member, you can hit the join button, buy the subscribe button, or hit the link in the description down below. And for a couple bucks a month, you get exclusive videos every single week, exclusive polls that you can be a part of, and exclusive emoji to use in the chat down below, with all those extra perks added on top of it. But appreciate you guys sticking towards the end. If you enjoyed, hit that like button, hit that subscribe, and the notification bell. Comment down below your thoughts on the Kadri trade fits and who you think is the best fit. And click on this card as well for all my trade content right in one playlist. And I will see you in the next one. Have a fantastic hockey day, and goodbye.